right, cool. Well, this is really awkward. I wasn't expecting to hold a microphone, but I don't know. I feel like I'm juggling two different things in my hands. So I may just speak really loud. Can you not hear me? I'm really loud at speaking, though. All right, we'll use this. All right, my name's Kevin Mack. I'm a UI UX developer. I work at Cardinal Solutions, so we're a consulting firm, and we work on a wide range of different projects. So I was initially supposed to be talking about onboarding of customers and kind of the journey of converting customers, but due to my schedule, and I wanted to do some research and kind of go out and talk to all the different startups in town, I did not have time to complete my research, so I switched over to talk about style guides and really building out interfaces. And my Twitter handle is Nice Transition. All right, one other kind of plug here. I started the Columbus Web Group with Adam Weiss about 3 years ago, and the Columbus Web Group is a user group here in Columbus, Ohio. We have over 1,500 users. We put on monthly events. Our whole goal is just to inspire people. So come to one of our monthly meetups and learn something, apply it for the next day. We do a wide range of different topics. We're targeting designers, developers, project managers, or anyone that's really looking to learn. We also do weekend workshops that are 1 to 4 week long courses that have 10 people per class. And why they have 10 people per class is because we want to base the content around the 10 people. So if you get in one of those classes and they sell it as quick as 2 minutes and as long as 26 hours, if you get in, we send an email to you and we say, what's your background? What do you want to get out of this class? And we create a course around you. In addition to that, we recently kicked off a mentoring program where junior people can be paired up with senior people or anyone that's looking to learn. We have a lot of really awesome things coming up. You can find out more about us at columbuswebgroup.com and follow us on CBUS Web Group for all of our upcoming events. And I encourage you to come out and party with us. So I could talk all day about myself and definitely the Columbus Web Group, but I'm talking about style guides. And there's going to be 8 different sections I talk about. Each one is an hour long. So I'm going to start with a definition, kind of go into the contents and what makes a style guide. I'm going to talk about tacos because it's Cinco de Mayo. Then I'm going to talk about something that I've been working on over the past year. It's about the layers of style guides and kind of the architecture and building out different style guides. I'm going to say the word style guide 1 billion times. Then getting into the ownership of style guides, the process for making one, and because everyone that usually talks is usually talking about positive things, but there are a lot of pain points when building out any project, especially something as big as a style guide. So I'm going to kind of highlight some of those, and hopefully they're help you kind of plan for building out a style guide, and then the benefits, because everyone likes benefits. Woo! I'll try not to be boring too. If I'm being boring, can someone just like wave their hand around and I'll be a little bit more exciting. But style guides, I don't know why I'm flickering so much, but style guides are something that I've been doing on every single project probably for the past 6 years. And over these past 6 years, I've learned a lot. And even before I started using style guides, I've been developing since '95. And one of the things I always did was kind of dissect the design and start indexing all the different components of my interface, or the pieces that you're interacting with from a web app. And I would build them out independently and then try to reuse them as much as possible. And then style guides became really popular, and there's a bunch of different tools out there. But today I'm not talking about the tools or the different frameworks. So how many people are familiar with Bootstrap? All right, so how many people like Bootstrap? All right, well, so I'm anti-Bootstrap. I actually really oppose it because of the way that it's architected and also crafted. And when you're implementing it inside of your interface, so if you have a small application or a large application, it runs into a lot of problems because you're always overriding it. One of the things I always call it, well, I abbreviate it to BS, and I also call it boot crap because I like that. But in this presentation, I'm not talking about Bootstrap. And when you're building out a style guide, you should try to avoid using frameworks like Bootstrap. So everything I'm talking about is creating a custom interface and making sure that it's fulfilling the needs of your content and the experience that you have. Certain tools like Bootstrap are really far-reaching, and they're aiming to fulfill the needs of all these unknowns, and they just don't work in a scalable manner. So getting into kind of the core aspects of what it's, so it's not a bootstrap, but it is a bootstrap. So meaning that when you're starting a project, as you're planning a style guide, you should be trying to look for ways that you can improve the process and kind of get going for future development on your projects or other applications. Style guides contain design patterns, which are common like layouts that are fulfilling the needs of the content, and they also include styles and markup for components, so HTML and CSS. So in this world, we're talking about digital style guides, not a traditional brand style guide, and they're all web-based. They have visual representation of the actual interface, which makes sense, but you can see them, so designers can go there and actually visually see them. They have actual code, so referencing code that you can copy and utilize in other applications and share across your team. And documentation, and I feel like documentation is one of the biggest things that people kind of forget about, and we always think of it as like this annoying thing to do, but they're really, really important for a successful style guide, is to have references of how to utilize, how to implement, and also the do's and don'ts of a single component, similar to like any brand book that you may have. They include all sorts of variants and a wide variety of components, and they're really meant for all the different contexts that you have out there, and there's a huge focus on responsive web design. How many people are familiar with responsive web design? Cool. All right, so looking at this interface, this is just kind of a mock-up, and I'm going to be using this throughout this presentation. So this is clearly not a true interface. It's just to represent an interface, so don't think that this is some weird website. But here's the desktop view, and you can see that there's a 2-column grid here at the bottom. And then when we go on mobile, it goes into this single-column grid. And this is one of those dimensions of responsive web design, and the size, and making sure that your components are going to adapt to different sizes. But the different contexts, and when you're building out a style guide, you need to think not just, I have this 2-column grid and it's going to go to a single-column grid, but what if I have a 2-column grid that I want to keep as a 2-column grid on mobile? Or what if I want a 2-column grid on mobile and a single-column grid on desktop? And you need to have all those variants and all those different contexts when you're building out individual components, and being able to document it and also have those code available and those examples for your team. Microphone. And I'm an incredible broken record when I talk about interfaces as well as design. I always say make it scalable, maintainable, and flexible. And by scalable, I mean you're not just targeting for one application. You're trying to look at every single thing that you're building across your whole organization, as well as the unknowns, and kind of future-proofing for future campaigns as well as applications that you're building. Maintainability is really, really huge, making sure that the code is clean, that the references are there, and if your brand changes or anything changes in your organization, you can add, you can change, you can adapt. Flexible, and by flexible here I'm talking about the content, because in today's web that's the most important piece. It's always been the most important piece. So flexible to fulfill the needs of your users as well as the content that you're going to be delivering. So getting into the next section is the contents of the style guide. So crack it open. I was talking about the front end earlier. So that's the CSS and your JavaScript, and of course that includes your HTML. And I used to not think that JavaScript existed inside of a style guide, but recently I've been saying that style guides should include JavaScript and more of a global style guide for those interactions of different components that you have. But they're primarily CSS as well as HTML. The other core components of when you're thinking about a style guide, and this is more base setting, is we're talking about the interface, so the pieces that people are interacting with, those different components, as well as the experience. So as you're building out a style guide, you're not just building out a bunch of weird components or small components like a button, but you're thinking about how people are going to be utilizing them and taking advantage of them. And then I included this awesome effect. I've always wanted to use that effect. There's 2 other effects that I've wanted. I was just like, oh, whoever uses that. But the primary focus needs to be on the content, and your interface and the experience needs to be focused on that most importantly. And even though we're talking about designing components, we still need to be designing around content. And especially if you don't know the content, you should start thinking about what are the possibilities of the content that will live inside there. Back to that flexibility. Now, listing out some of the main things as you're building out a style guide. And this is kind of a list of when, on day one, what do I need to include in a style guide? It's branding. And digital branding is really different than the traditional branding books that you may be familiar with in organizations or as you're thinking about a startup. So they're usually like these thick PDFs that you share and you hired some agency or your marketing person inside built it out. But in the digital sense, it's still that same thing, but you need to be thinking about it in different contexts as well as variants and sizes. So logos may be small, like you may need to change or adapt your logo on smaller screens versus larger screens. One of the other things is with color. So different screens have different resolutions as well as how they render color. Cyan is one of those like great examples that I always like to give when talking about branding in the digital sense. So at Cardinal Solutions, one of our main colors is this blue color. When we print it off, it looks like this dark blue. Our walls are kind of more of an aqua color. It has like more of a green color to it. It's just a wide range. But then when you look at it on our website and all of our digital sense, it's like this bright blue. And now we as an organization right now are going through some brand refinements, and we're trying to identify what is our actual blue. Do we want it to look like that print blue, or do we want it to look like this really bright 1990s blue? It's still a good color. Typography is just looking at all the different section headers and article headers and page headers. It's really, really important, but this is where you'll kind of start in making sure that you're building out and fulfilling the needs. Call to actions are your CTAs, which is just abbreviation for call to actions, buttons, anchors, and how people are going to navigate from one experience to another. This can also include different toggle states and accordions, but anything that anyone's going to be interacting with and starting to think about how to build those out in the different states of them. Media treatments, which are your images, especially responsive images, background treatments, and video, and how they're going to work across the different landscapes. One of the big things is setting guidelines around imagery and putting rules around, like, here are the dimensions, and this is how it's going to live on the web. My buddy Tim Vonnerlo and I created a methodology around creating images for the web. It's called Asset Template Guides, which brings traditional print to the web and kind of follows the same rules of bleed, safety, and whatever, the trim. But there's a whole presentation on that. Form elements, really no interface can exist without a form. And this is also how we can get into the performance of the website, making sure that you're capturing the data and how people are interacting with it. Definitely very important. And forms are usually one of the things that people screw up the most when building out an interface. And there's a lot of things that you have to take into consideration across different browsers. List items, probably the least sexiest out of all of these, but it's one of those things that every interface usually requires. And structural. Structure is actually probably the most important next to my very last one, but these are your grids, these are your tabular data. This is how the content is actually going to be contained inside of your interface. And there's two different ways of approaching it. There's containers for content and content for containers. And the difference between those two is whether you're building the actual structure to fulfill the needs of the content, or putting restrictions around the content to be like, we have a minimum amount of characters or a maximum amount of characters that we can have in here, and this is how it's going to be displayed across the different landscapes. Navigation, at a global level, it's probably the least important, but you should still have the strategy around how they're going to be built out and having examples around it. Why I say they're the least important at the global level is because from different applications and different use cases, they're not going to be the most reusable component. Because when you're talking about navigation in the web today, you have to kind of build them out more custom than anything else, especially in a responsive landscape. Utility and helpers are things that you add inside your code to kind of reuse and extend the design or the treatment of how you're displaying the content that you have. These are things like alignment. So whether I want my content to be center aligned, right aligned, left aligned. These are also things like maybe changing a button color from blue to red or whatever it may be. So they're just classes that have single use that you can extend. And then, most importantly, is the front-end architecture. And when building it out, so these are the list of things that you have to do, but the overarching thing on here is the architecture, and making sure that you're crafting this, again, for that scalability, flexibility, and maintainability. There are a lot of methodologies that are somewhat complex that you have to think about when designing and crafting these style guides, which are, I like to recommend SMAX is one of them, object-oriented CSS, of course, and Atomic Design, as well as CSS. But those are the ways that you're crafting your code And that's really what a style guide is. A lot of people get in this discussion of like, all right, I'm going to use Pattern Lab as my framework for my style guide. I'm going to use Fabricator or some other tool that's out there, but in reality those are just the displaying of how you're listing out the individual components, and it's not the what's really important, which is the back end and how it's actually crafted together. So style guides have two purposes, is for documentation, for implementation, as well as reference, but then also as a tool to index and list out all the individual components. All right, so getting into Taco. And TACO is actually an acronym for Talk About Component Organization. Blink. And as I said, it's Cinco de Mayo. So how many people like tacos? Tacos are great. Yeah. All right, so here's a taco shell. Inside of a traditional taco, maybe you have lettuce. You have tomatoes. You have some protein in there. And then you have some cheese. Now, if I want to have more tacos, well, it's easy. I just use the same components of it, and I build them out, and I have 3 tacos. Now, if I want to make something else besides a taco, I need to introduce a new ingredient or component. So here we will have a flour tortilla. That's the effect I was talking about. So here's a flour tortilla. But inside of this, if I want to make a quesadilla, I still have lettuce, tomato, some protein, which looks like crap, and some some cheese, and then I put another flour tortilla on the top and grill it, and now I have completely two different things, but they're made from the same ingredients. They're just really introducing one more thing. And now we throw in one of my favorite things is the burrito. And the burrito, again, it can be made of the same ingredients. And actually, the quesadilla and the burrito is just a different form factor. So why I think this is a good analogy for building out and thinking about style guides is reusing and taking the same components and just thinking about them in different contexts and maybe introducing just one minor change to it, but having all these different variants that you have out there. And in code, it's really important not to have like just recreating the same thing over and over again, but trying to utilize and take advantage of everything that you've crafted and built out. So it's this idea of not just recreating the wheel to recreate it, and do what works and create something when you need to, but don't rely on creating something. Try to reuse that same experience, those same components over and over again. So it's reuse, combine, and create when necessary. So getting into something that I've been working on over the past year, it's called Style Guide Layers. And this is based off of a lot of failure as well as a lot of things that I've done wrong on client projects as well as individually on my own projects. And based off this has become a really great architecture as I'm crafting out projects for my current clients as well as other people out there. By that I mean Madison. So there's 4 layers here. There's a global layer, there's a brand layer, there's an app layer, and there's a campaign layer. The global layer are the core components. So this is DOM, or the HTML, the structure of your code, as well as CSS. So these are indexing, kind of going out there, and the base out of everything in your design. And this is where we really can make the difference of something like Bootstrap that has really nice HTML structures, but the code goes really horrible. At this top layer, you're not thinking about the styles yet. You're just thinking about the structures and indexing all the individual pieces. The next layer is the brand. And these get where you have kind of core styling, and you add any specific components that are related to the brand. And by specific components, maybe you have 2 different brands inside your company. Maybe one's for kids, maybe one's for adults. So maybe there's some additional components that are meant for kids. And the idea here is that you are actually focusing and building out your primary core components for the individual applications, which are like websites or anything web-based at this app layer. And why this is the most important layer is this is where you're focusing around the content, and you're designing your interface around the restrictions as well as the limitations of whatever the content may be. So this is where actually all the magic kind of happens when building out an interface. And by building out those first 2 layers, you're making sure that it's successful and scalable across multiple applications inside your organization. The campaign layer are kind of your one-offs. So say you're an organization or you're a startup or whatever you are, and you have these first 3 layers. And you want to put on a monthly campaign. And it's going to be unique, but you know you need to utilize some of like your call to actions, your buttons, and some of your structures. But it's going to introduce something, maybe it's a game, and it's not related to anything that's ever going to be reused inside your interface. This is where you would build it out. And again, also if you're hiring a marketing firm, they can inherit the first 3 layers, but then you can let them go crazy and bonkers at this lower layer, and you know it's not going to bubble up and kind of get in there and have trash collection over time. So the brand layer goes from this top to bottom, and it inherits from this layer, and it applies the styling all the way down. Same thing with global. So throughout all these, if I build something at the global level, I can access it at the lowest level and utilize it and reuse it. If I'm at the app level and I realize I have 2 different apps and something's becoming a common component, I can bubble it up and put it in my global layer, and then it becomes more accessible about future projects. When building out style guides, it's better to really focus on that global layer and keep it thin. And then as you're building out that application layer, put it in there. And once you start realizing that you have multiple components that are being reused, bubbling it up and putting it either in the brand and global layer. So here's an example of a style guide or a company that has 2 different brands inside of it. So again, the brand is inheriting on the left-hand side the styles and maybe the unique look and feel on the components on the left side, and the right side has their own ones. It's to avoid that collision and the competing of both your CSS as well as your components and organization of the code. Here we have 2 apps inside that brand, but you could also have 2 apps on the left-hand side. Apps can be things like your .com, they can be your maybe member portal, or the authenticated side could be your HTML5 hybrid application. I don't know, anything web-based can live there as multiple apps, and you're targeting them around the content. Then that last layer, and you won't really be able to see it that well, but those are multiple campaigns. And campaigns don't have to just be a monthly long campaign for Christmas. It could be an individual section or page of your site that you really want to target. So if maybe you want to have a page about your overall customer experience, and you know that those pieces are never going to be reused, then you kind of build it at that bottom layer. Getting into more of a nerdy example here, but I hope this helps for anyone that's a nerd. Who here is a developer or works with developers? All right, how many people know what a button is? All right, cool. So this is an example of a button at a global layer, and this is just showing some HTML inside here of what a button is. At the global layer, I have kind of this reset and normalize of everything inside here. And this is crafted in a way that I could switch it out from a button to an anchor or any type of CTA by just utilizing those 3 different classes I have there. So it's a button default, as well as a button primary, and the style here. One of the things, if you're familiar with CSS, these are selectors right here where it says before or after button, button default. One of the ones I don't have in there right now is primary. So this is an example of a primary button. At the brand layer, I introduce and extend the CSS. So I have, at the button layer, I'm never overriding, because CSS is not a language of overriding, it's a language of extending. And the same thing with building out an interface. So HTML and CSS, you should be thinking about extending it. At the button layer, I introduce EFRA. If I was using an anchor, I wouldn't have to do that, but buttons don't inherit the font by default. And then I also say, across all buttons on my site in my brand, I want no borders on it. And then for button default, I say all my buttons that are a default button have a bold weight, and they're always uppercase. And then I get into the fun primary color. So this is where it becomes blue and has a color black. Now, if I have a second brand inside there, I'm utilizing still the same HTML code, and all I'm doing is extending those CSS classes, changing the font size, adding some additional transformation on the text, as well as introducing a border as well as a background color. So say down the road we decide we want all buttons across my company to have a border. Well, what I could actually do is take this line of CSS as border 125 rem solid, and actually bubble it up to my global layer. And then that would make all my buttons across the site have a border around it. Hopefully I didn't lose anyone on that one. All right, so ownership. This is my least favorite conversation, especially when dealing with clients, but it's always fun. So this is the part of like, who owns the style guide? And they're like, we have this really awesome person over here that knows how to develop websites. And he's like, I'm going to build a style guide. And it's going to be in a silo, and it's not going to be reusable. Well, that's because to actually build a style guide for a company, especially a big organization, it takes a lot of people. And not just one person kind of can own it. It needs to be across the whole organization in the different departments. So here we have IT, so your developers, your front-end devs, UI architects, you have your marketing department, those branding people. You also have the user experience team and talking about those experiences and the engagements of the individual components. You have your QA team making sure that you're testing in its quality from the style guide layer, as well as the business and making sure that everyone's kind of signed on. And this is a group effort to do this right and making sure that everyone has their say and it's not just happening siloed. A lot of organizations have multiple style guides, and what that happens when you need to update it, it becomes this nightmare. If your brand changes, it becomes very hard. You have to then find every single style guide out there and update and make the same tweaks. So ideally you have one, with the exception at the application layer. But the creation of it, and this is kind of the process that we do at Cardinal, as well as the recommendation that I have for kind of crafting things out to be successful. So you start with a brand strategy, similar to as if you were doing this for a brand book, identifying all your brand identity. User research, and user research from an experience side and how you're going to be interacting with those individual components. But then you can also take it on the flip side and look at the style guide that you're actually building for your internal team and interview and do research inside your organization and make sure that the style guide is going to be set up for success and how your team is organized and can copy, manage, search, and identify those individual components. So it's both on the output of the components as well as the tool itself to utilize. Indexing components, so this is a really huge one. Before starting a style guide, it's similar to, I had that list in the beginning, but what you want to do is go through all your different applications and identify all those common patterns and different components that you have and make sure that you're building them into your style guide to be used. Style tiles, and these are kind of going away, but I still like to utilize them. I think of them as if I'm redesigning my kitchen or my bathroom and I hire a designer. And they come with some color swaps, they come with some floor samples, maybe some carpet samples, and a wide range of different things. And they have 3 different buckets, and they say, hey, which one do you like the most? That's kind of what style tiles are for the web, especially if you have a new brand that you're trying to identify, is making sure that that brand from the beginning standpoint, the typography treatments, the color, some of the general feel and vibe of your company is being fulfilled from an early stage and you're having those conversations. From there, they kind of evolve into element collages, which I have an example of that on my next slide. But what these are just individual pieces of your interface that you're indexing and making sure that you're actually building them out. They become the architecture for developing the code. After the element collage, or maybe even in parallel, you're designing and developing these in HTML and CSS and actually building out the style guide. Stress tests are really important, and what stress tests are, this is something that we came up with at Cardinal, was with every single component that we're building, fulfilling it with the minimum and maximum amount of characters or the requirements for each component, and making sure that it works across the different landscapes. If we identify a button maybe has a 140 character limit, well, then we need to make sure that once it gets to that size and it's getting cut off, that it's adapting or it's changing, or have some alternative that's going to be able to be used for 140 plus characters. So stress tests are just including your content and testing them against the different variants, contexts, and limitations. That also works with technology limitations too and different frameworks. Context, I kind of explained this, but this is more on not just the responsive side, but variants as well as contextual factors like touch versus having touch capabilities, swipe capabilities, or having a pointer clicker. Oh, and testing. Testing is definitely very key, but I said that earlier. So looking at a quick example of an element collage, and again, we do this on every project, and this kind of happens at the same time right after we've indexed all the components. So here on the left-hand side, you see some colors. Here's a representation of the headers, as well as some of those media treatments and some core components. So inside here by core components, I know those are common interface patterns that I need to develop and design, and the development team needs to identify and make sure that they're building them out. Also, it's nice to include some like treatment on navigation. And again, these are kind of blueprints for the development process. Kind of sticking on the color treatment. So this year, I'm putting out an open source project every month. This was my project from 2 months ago, and it was this theory. I mentioned Tim earlier, but Tim and I had been talking about building interfaces and common patterns. So I put out on my CodePen this color naming convention. And we identified that majority of brands have a primary color and a secondary color. And then most interfaces have that primary, secondary, and sometimes a tertiary color. And then there's also a dark color, so the darkest color in your palette, the lightest color in your palette, and then what we refer to as an accent color. So you have these 5 from the start. And then for each individual color, what you have is a dark version of it, a light version of it, and an accent version of it. So again, if you have those 5 colors and you have these 4 actually variants of each, you have 20 colors per palette. That should be enough colors for your full interface. And you do that for every single one. So there's primary, there's secondary, and then there's accent and light. And again, if you have a tertiary color, you would have 24 colors. But what this does is it creates consistency in your interface, as well as instead of being like, use the dark red color, you can say use the primary dark or use the secondary dark color. And it becomes a common way for us to communicate as a team. And if that color ever changes, it's not a semantic color. It makes it really easy to cascade throughout the design. Which is also really cool for documentation, because then you have to update the word red. So another thing, I'm releasing this month. It's called object-oriented typography, and it's the identification of, in an interface, of the largest font size to the smallest font size. And it's a separation of the structure, the implementation of the content in different contexts, as well as the styling for it. So every interface has a page header, a page subheader, a section header, a section subheader, an article header, an article subheader, and then also a paragraph tag. So in object-oriented typography, you're identifying those and you're listing them out in your element collage and building those out. So those are 2 really great places to start. And if you do those successfully, you're kind of keying up your project to kind of follow that path, and also the communication for your whole team. We have some buttons, we have some form things here, and you can make this as big as you want. Another thing to really call out about this is we're not building a page here. They're just a listing of different components, and they're actually structured like this. They're meant to be kind of chaotic because you're just supposed to list out all the different pieces. So after we build out the element collage, as I said, we kind of go into the code. We write it in HTML and CSS and make sure that we have anything in there. Element collages also become really nice if you want to build out your interface in your programs like Sketch or Photoshop and build out those concepts, because it's also a listing of all the components, but in more of the traditional design tools. But in this case, I'm talking about the conversion of it into HTML, and I build out a page. And then from here, I'm just utilizing the same core components on my style guide and trying to combine them and creating new pieces when needed, and having things like a structure and building out a full page. From there, I can easily make individual pages or unique ones. So utilizing the same components, just in different variations and combinations, kind of back to like that the quesadilla to a burrito. It's the same ingredients, but they're just kind of structured differently, and I'm taking advantage of those individual components. So getting into the pain points, which is my kind of second to last section here. I forgot I put that there. I really like memes. All right, so they can't solve it all. One of the biggest pain points outside, this is definitely the biggest pain point, and it goes back to that ownership, is the politics involved. And this is, even if you're a startup and you're kind of planning for your first project, there's still politics involved and making sure that you're setting the priorities. So a style guide should happen as the first thing before you're even developing that application. You can be doing your research and starting the requirement process of what the project is going to entail, but the style guide kind of has to happen first, which a lot of people try to do it in parallel. I have to do it a lot of times as I'm building out an application for a project. I'm building a style guide, but it adds a lot of challenges. So one of the pieces of politics besides just the ownership is how do we invest in the time it takes to build one? But the time, my response to that is the time that you put up front is just preparing for success and making sure that you're going to have a seamless project afterwards. They take a lot of effort, and with that, they also take a lot of hardcore experience. So this isn't just necessarily your typical developer or full stack dev. It's someone that really understands architecture of building out an interface, HTML and CSS, to kind of craft it properly. But even if you're not lucky to have someone that has that skill set, just kind of understanding how it's going to be broken down and making sure that it's scalable is really all you need. But it takes a lot of effort, and it can delay the project in the beginning, but hopefully you make up for that time at the end. It can contain complex methodologies, which I say this isn't really that big of an issue, because if you have someone that is very skilled at crafting and creating this, if they build this correctly, it doesn't really matter what's underneath the hood, as long as someone can open it up at a later time, manage and maintain it, and make updates as needed. The actual methodologies for crafting them doesn't really matter to someone that's copying and pasting it and putting it into an interface, or the development team or the business side. But that is kind of a pain point for someone that is not familiar with those methodologies, being like, what is that? So they're platform agnostic, which I don't think this is necessarily a pain point, but it's a hard thing for people to grasp. And by platform agnostic, when you're building out these interfaces and these style guides, you're not focusing on just one application that's built maybe in an MVC framework like Angular or Ember or whatever it may be. You're looking at it as, this is my interface, these are the core components, and I'm going to utilize it everywhere I want. Which a lot of people are like, well, how does that integrate into Angular 2? It's like, well, you can just use the same DOM. Don't get too caught up on that. But that's a conversation I have a lot about style guides. They require updates, which, again, I don't think this is a bad thing, because they are their own project. They are a living, breathing project, and they should change and adapt over time, just as any application or any brand or project. So they do require update, and they do require maintenance, and maintenance can even be maybe a browser stops supporting a single function in CSS and you realize it breaks. Well, the benefit of that is if you build this and craft this in a way, you can fix it in one place and it should cascade through all your different applications. This is number 8, which has the 8 benefits. I had this in another presentation too. I couldn't think of 2 more to have like 10 benefits, but it's just 8. There's a lot of benefits. These are just my favorites. All right, so one of the best things is the improving of the collaboration of the different team members. So and I don't mean just developers here when I say development, I mean the execution team, your designers, your developers, your UX people, or anyone that's providing the content, your copywriters. Just how people are collaborating and communicating, and kind of separating away from, let's talk about nerdy front-end code, and let's talk about the actual performance of this application, what we're building. Reduction in development efforts once they're created, so you can spin off new applications, new variants very easily, and get to my next point, which is the increased speed to market. So again, once they're completed, this is where you kind of make up the time. You have all these indexes, and you can just combine them and create different pages. So it does, for that initial release, it takes a little bit of time, but everything after that is an increased speed to market. Number 4 is the alignment of quality code. The idea of one of these being built is it looks like one developer developed it. So all your team is communicating in the same language, the same methodologies. And it also extends to the communication of the team and talking about things back to like that primary dark color. You're, as a team, communicating and making sure that you're aligned and you're not confusing each other. And one of the ones I like the best is you're focusing on the experience rather than just building out the same things over and over again. Throughout my career, I build out some of the same components probably 1,000+ times, and I hate doing that. And it's always a pain, like a major annoyance when I have to build the same thing or I can't find it inside the code, and I'm just like, oh, I'll build that again. So that takes some time, and it prevents me from actually talking about what we need to do and the goals of the project as well as the experience. And utilizing and having a style guide allows you to focus on the actual experience than building out the same core components every single time. Iterating in the browser is really, really awesome. You're working inside the media that it's actually going to live in. So as opposed to having a Photoshop file or a sketch file and being like, someday this is going to live in the browser. What's it going to look like on mobile? Well, here's my concept. Well, building inside and iterating in the browser, you actually get to see it the way that it's going to be presented, and you're designing and crafting it in that way. This is a really, really cool one. Which I didn't really much think about this until last year. So I was working on a really large redesign for a bank, and we were 6 months along in the project and kind of getting near our first MVP. We get an email one morning and they say, hey, we couldn't tell you guys this earlier, but our brand changed. So they did a brand redesign from their marketing group, and no one ever bothered to tell us. So they actually, in that email, were expecting us to come back with a change request. And they were expecting like a 2 to 4 week turnaround. But because of the way that we crafted it and designed it, all we had to do was update a couple things. And within 16 hours, we had the new brand implemented inside the actual interface. So we didn't even have to touch DOM. We just had to update, or HTML. We just had to touch CSS, and it happened really quickly. We didn't have to even retest. So why they're really important is the ever-changing, evolving brand, not just adding components, but if there's a huge global shift, you can easily update it in one spot. And consistency. So consistency is from application to application, experience to experience, making sure that users know the components and those interactions that you've spent so much time crafting, making sure that they're consistent. So if you roll out new functionality on your website, it's not anything different. You've already trained your users how to interact with your applications. Why create something new? And if you have this built out, you can just plop and reuse and iterate inside the browser. But consistency also makes you look really buttoned up and gives you a more beautiful application. So ending with some last minute takeaways and a good style guide, which are kind of related to also the benefits. And I said a lot of these themes throughout this, but support for multiple platforms, and by here I mean multiple applications. So as you're building these out, making sure that you're not just designing for one application, but trying to think of the whole landscape, the future of your business and what you're going to be building out. I guess I have another click. Detailed documentation. This is what really separates a good one and a bad one. And these are implementation guides. And also if you're hiring some friend of a friend or using some offshore developers, this becomes really critical and crucial for making sure that you're successful. One that also kind of goes without, goes overlooked is it doesn't compete. So crafting and designing this and architecting in a way that is unique and using namespacing and a convention that isn't going to compete with other libraries. So if I'm bringing in a third-party open source tool and integrating inside my experience, I'm not going to have collision of styles. Or if I'm integrating inside of a framework, like a CMS that maybe has some core styling built into it, I'm not competing against them. I'm always designing with them. So crafting it in a way where you're not competing. Even if you're using something like Bootstrap and you have a custom style guide, this is very important to make sure that you're crafting it in a way that you can kind of utilize both of them together. And the most important thing is that it's easy to use and understand. And a good style guide should be able to be implemented and reused by not just developers, but even your design team or someone with zero experience with development. It should be a reference and easy to identify which components I need, and then make it be easy to copy and combine and be like, I want this plus this and this to get this output. So if you do it really well, you can have a designer actually be working in code, but it's really just copying and pasting. So one of the requirements if you have a good one, is if you know how to copy and paste to utilize. So that's my last point. I think I have 10 minutes, do I, for questions?
Questions? Come on.
I got one.
Yeah.
You talked about, the benefit number 6 somewhere in your list about iterating in browser. Do you rely on, like Firebug or some sort of debugging tool to make the change, look into it, and what are the strategies you use to make sure that it is going to render correctly, in, I guess, let's say, key browsers, right?
Yeah.
Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer or something. How do you guys, do that iteration and make sure that it's done in the least amount of time, but renders across all the platforms in a consistent way?
Yeah, so when building out individual components, there's what's referred to as the user agent. So every single HTML element for the web has a user agent and base styling for it. One of the great starting points, if you're not familiar with those and you don't know those from like years of practice and experience, you can actually use Firebug to do this, but I typically use Chrome developer tools or recommend that. If you right click on any element, you can see the user agent built-in CSS properties, and making sure that when you're building out a style for like a button, that you're identifying the overrides for the different use cases. So like Anchor has different user agent because it's meant for a different implementation versus what a button is. And from the building out of the components, always constantly testing. And when you get into the iterating inside the browser, you should have core components that have already been tested. So it becomes a lot lighter in the QA process. You should have less bugs by just combining the pieces that have individually been tested. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
How you doing?
good. How are you?
Fantastic. What's the difference between something like Twitter Bootstrap and then one of these style
I don't know if I really want to talk about that. I don't have enough time, but everything. No, Bootstrap, it does a good job if you don't know how to develop. But everything that's inside of Bootstrap, if you have someone that has even minimal knowledge of HTML and CSS, they should be able to recreate anything that's in Bootstrap within a couple moments. I think that was a quote from Ben Callahan from Sparkbox. He was just like, anything Bootstrap you can build in a couple moments. And it has a lot of bloat. And one of the biggest issues of it is what's referred to as specificity and inheritance problems. So as you're trying to brand it and create it around your actual company look, feel, and the different application use cases, you're fighting against it as opposed to kind of extending it, which CSS is all about. You can use Bootstrap if you want to just use Bootstrap. And one of the biggest issues is also the structural components. It's far-reaching. It's meant for every single use case as opposed to the individual use cases that you have for your application, company, or experience. That's the shortest I can be on that. Don't use it.
How about if you establish sort of your digital brand and now you want to extend that out into, now you're selling T-shirts, or you put on an event and you want to extend the design and branding that you come up with outside of the digital world? Any recommendations?
Yeah, so I've actually seen, I'm trying to think of who released one of these. There was, I tweeted this the other day, but there was a listing of all the top style guides inside there, and someone even had their digital style guide and then their brand style guide. And you went to one URL and they were right next to each other, which is pretty cool. So there was a reference for print as well as like their different materials out there. I mean, converting from digital to traditional is the same pain point as taking the traditional and bringing it into the digital space. I don't really have a good answer for that, but you can include your traditional style guide inside of a digital one if you want to, and just have it be your global brand style guide. I'll retweet that today if you follow me on Twitter.
More questions?
Okay. I'm a designer, so forgive me, I guess. But have you seen success with any companies like deeply integrating style guides? So as you change the style guide, it pushes
Yeah, well, and one of the big things, so how we work is it's always agile, and we're always iterating through different pieces and parts of an application, especially if it's large. Style guides have definitely improved the communication, not with just our internal team, but with also our clients, because I can be on the phone call with someone that's across country and be like, they're like, can we update this and change it? And I can easily make a change there while I'm in the phone, maybe in a go-to meeting. It definitely does have lots and lots of benefits, and it's really about that, seeing it right there in the actual output. So it's really that iterating inside the browser and seeing the final piece of it. So that's definitely the biggest thing. And then once it actually exists, is that reduction in development costs as well as speed to market. Because your estimates just keep going down and down and down, and turnaround should be faster. Or you can use that time to focus about the experience as opposed to just building the same crap again.
Got time. One more question. Come on, folks. Right there.
When you're designing a new component, do you jump straight to HTML, or do you ever do any design work with a tool, Sketch, whatever?
Yeah, so definitely do a combination. It varies based off of what I'm building out. If it's something like a button, when working with a client, we always do like an element collage, or if it's a big application, do an element collage, because you want to look at all the different contexts of it. So like a button's a good example because it has a hover state, it has a focus state, it has an active state. And I can put a button next to like my anchors, and ideally to have similar treatments, I want my hover states for my anchors as well as my buttons to kind of go through the same color. So say I have a blue anchor and a blue button, when I hover over it, I may want my text to turn red, the button background color to turn red. Maybe when I click on it, they both turn yellow. So it allows me to kind of put it out there and architect it in my CSS based around it. But when I'm actually building the code, I usually start with my HTML and then craft the CSS around it. And I usually start with small pieces and then add additional helper classes or extensions of it to keep kind of fulfilling the needs of whatever the design is. Some of my elements have like 10 different CSS classes on them. Does that answer that? Hi, Adam.
All right. Yeah.
So in regard to mobile, and so you're building your digital style guide, you're using a browser, do you find yourself getting on an actual device and looking at the style guide on the device? And if so, what are some tips as far as building that style guide in order to easily do it on mobile?
That's a great question. Yeah, and whenever building out any interface or anything, you should actually be testing on real devices, because there's always like some weird hiccup that happens on Android, or a new release of Safari or Chrome for the iPhone, for iOS. So I definitely always have it on those devices, and I'm testing back. But I'm doing the classic, making the browser smaller, and then when I get to a point, looking at the actual device. I use Browser Sync. Browser Sync's really awesome, so it has auto reload as I'm writing my code. I hit save, it updates it on my browser, it updates it on my phone, and I just go to a URL and I can see live updating as I'm writing the code. And that's one of the most beneficial things when working on a device. I don't have to hit the refresh button, it just automatically does it if I'm in the same network. Browser Sync is like a lifesaver, and it saves so much time.
I have a question.
Hi, David.
David always said cats.
Yeah.
We create a lot of brands, and we create a lot of sub-brands within brands. So how do you suggest someone who's not exactly at your level, but as someone who creates a lot of brands, to think about what you're saying?
That's a good question. Yeah. We can kind of take that offline, but ideally it's still, every interface has those same core components. And looking at your brand, and a lot of companies think that they need to change from one piece to another. And maybe your buttons, so I was talking about that global layer and then the brand layer. For Civic Hacks, you have a lot of the same brand, but inside there you have different, I would say, more of applications and different implementation of that exact brand. So it's always that red, white, blue, and sometimes black background. But looking at it more at the application layer and indexing all those different components. So like your header treatments are very similar, your buttons are very similar, all the themes are very similar. So you could do that once, and then as you're building it out for other applications, just reuse it and then make custom versions of it. Luckily, I'm very familiar with your brand.
All right, that's all I have, folks.
Cool.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.